So, believe it or not, I try hard not to make videos first thing in the morning. The reason is because I am least encumbered by exhaustion. And in my life, interacting face to face with people, but also in these videos to a lesser extent, I try to insulate people from that. So, in a recent, I believe it was a video, but it may have been something I wrote out. Recently, I was thinking about and sharing ideas about chains and how sometimes some of the weakness that we labor under is a blessing from God because it actually helps us to be more effective in some way. And it's really hard to handle the full blast of what the Lord puts into my head and heart. And so I insulate people from that to protect them from it. And even with my own family, one of the reasons I wake up early is so I have several hours to myself each day. And on days like today, where I get up particularly early, I've been up since midnight, this is a particularly effective way of insulating them from the full blast. By the time I see them in a few more hours, I'll be quite tired, and getting into the rest of my day, I'll be much more capable of interfacing with other people at the level they operate on. And that's a good thing. But today I'm going to waive that and make a video, which might end up being quite long, where we're going to weave between several things. And I just want to share with you a little bit of what has gone through my mind and heart as I've looked at these things. So, I guess the genesis of this was this person, David, who made a YouTube comment. He actually made two of them. And unfortunately, I can't show you the other one. I suppose maybe he deleted it. The way the comment system works on YouTube is they come in and unfortunately they don't always show up, and they show up at random times relative to when they're posted. And sometimes I'll approve a comment and then it comes back and I have no idea why. And sometimes comments are lost even though I didn't do anything to cause that to happen. So it's quite a mystery, and it's really dumb. One of the things we're working on for upwardthought.org is a comment system, and we're pretty excited about that. But who knows how long that will take. Anyway, so until then, we're just trying to make do with what YouTube gives us. So I'll read to you this comment, and I'll try to reproduce the gist of what his other one said. So he says, if you say, quote, "the Lord told me," end quote, and you're wrong, then that is really bad. People just have no qualms against throwing around "the Lord said" as if they literally hear a voice in their head. That's called being a false prophet, dude. Read Jeremiah and Ezekiel. I wouldn't be so quick to assume God is speaking to you just because you need him to speak to you so bad that you put words in his mouth. So many people do that. I hate it. So I replied to this guy, I appreciate your concern and am familiar with the scriptures you refer to. If you are, I'd hope you'd consider the seriousness of calling someone a false prophet without first hearing their message, because I've never heard of this guy before, and this video happened to get out to YouTube's suggestions for whatever reason, which doesn't normally happen with videos that I make. Excuse me. And when that happens, of course, all the crazies come in. Not that this guy's crazy, but I'm sparing you from some of those other comments that came in. And here's what happens when, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. As your awareness increases, normal interactions with people will cause an enormous flood of ideas. Actually, any experience will, but it's a very unusual circumstance Now, hopefully that's recognizable to you just at the outset, because I would guess that if you were to read this comment, your mind doesn't flood with like 20 pages worth of thoughts, or this. It's a network of ideas that are connected to this. So just crafting a comment in reply to this is extremely taxing, because you have to query everything you know, and you have to distill what the greatest value that you could convey in a sentence or two to someone that doesn't share any of, or hardly any of, that understanding. And how do you do that? Now, of course, this is a problem that the Lord faces 24/7. He's trying to guide us to outcomes that are far greater than anything we can even imagine. And he has to do it through the tiniest windows of what we're willing to receive, which includes our background understanding, the sum total of our shared understanding between us and God, which is very little, because we're doofuses. And so, to the extent that you become like him, you will have to learn to be expert at this as well. And it's very difficult, because have you ever done something that's really hard and maybe you procrastinate, but it's on your mind, you have to get psyched up to do it, and then you get into it and it just takes everything. And then when you come out of it, it's almost like you need to wind down. Doing my own taxes is like that. Speaking of being taxing, sorry, it's too early for bad jokes. I've always had I've frequently had an atypical level of complexity in my taxes, just because of all the things I have going on in my life. And I learned at some point that most experts, quote unquote, don't actually have any idea what they're doing, and that I could do a better job than people who have degrees in things. And that is, of course, not always true, but it's been true enough times that's my initial assumption. And it's certainly that way with the taxes. So at first, because it was such not just a tedious thing, because there's so many books and everything, the instruction manuals and forms and everything you have to Google and research and learn about. But the system is just so abundantly stupid and unfair. You see, the Spirit of God is what the scriptural word would be quickens. But let's just use plain English. The Spirit of God is what it's the functioning. It's what causes our understanding to function. It's the fuel for our understanding. So, as your awareness increases, one thing that works against that is when you're in a situation where someone's lying to you, or there's injustice, or evil, or just stupidity, willful ignorance. All of these things are barriers that make it harder for you to exercise that supercharged, spiritually quickened understanding. Because as you increase the bandwidth of God's Spirit to you, it's not something that only works at church. In fact, it'll get you thrown out of church pretty quickly. But it's something that works all the time. And so you begin to be able to solve problems faster than other people could, or at least way faster than you could before, right? You come up with better ideas for things than you could before. It's supercharged, right? It's like dropping a massive engine into a tiny, crummy car. So there are other analogies that could be used there, okay? Like some superhero motif where they have some thing, it doesn't matter if we're talking about Power Rangers or He-Man, or anything in between, where He-Man has this sword that has the power to turn him into a superhero. And it's still him. He's still in there, but he's supercharged, right? And that's what the Spirit of God does. And it's not just in spiritual things. Samson had physical strength through the Spirit of God, right? That's as physical as you can get. Anyway, so when you hit spiritual impedance, it has that effect on your understanding as well. It's not just some symbolic spiritual resistance. It's not just some overtly churchy thing. It's when you encounter any kind of willful ignorance or any of the other things that I mentioned, it actually impedes your ability to operate at that supercharged level. And you have to fight against it. And this is one reason why Jesus went off by himself in the early mornings and told people to go away all the time. He had to recharge those batteries to get back to that. What it reminds me of is at one point, I built an apple crusher. The technical term is a scratter. That's fun to say. An apple scratter. And it's basically a hopper with a drum, and the drum has a bunch of pins on it, and it spins, and you drop apples into it, and it breaks them into tiny pieces, about the size of a dime. And that's a step before you press that pulp, and that's how you get apple cider, okay? So I built one of these because I didn't have $7,000 to buy one, and now I relived the process of building that in my head, and I'm trying to think of why I was talking about an apple scratter. Oh, so the drum with the pins on it, it has momentum. And actually, I built a flywheel on this to increase that momentum. And when the drum comes into contact, the spinning drum gets hit with an apple, it works against the momentum. Now, the flywheel's big enough that it just goes ahead and tears apart the apple anyway. And if you just throw one apple in, you're not even going to notice because the motor's powerful enough, the flywheel's large enough, the drum's heavy enough that the momentum overcomes the apple. If you fill the hopper, usually it's still just fine and it'll run and it won't get bogged down. But sometimes something will get pinned in there or whatever, and the drum gets bogged down. You have to turn the whole thing off and unpack the apples. And we're like that too. The earth is like that too. The earth's electromagnetic field is like this. And so when blasts come from the sun, which happens all the time, it smacks up against the earth's electromagnetic field. And most of the time, the field, it compresses kind of like a spring, but it stays intact enough to block us from this radiation. And then the field will come back. And you can see videos of this. If you Google it, you can look them up. It's kind of cool. And so this is a property we see all the time. And it's no surprise because the Spirit is a field. It does act like radiation. And it emits from sources. It's absorbed into things. Things react to it. And so forth, right? And so when you're functioning off this feed, you're like the sun. Well, I guess it's bad practice to use something for an analogy that people don't understand well. So I'm going to commit a faux pas here and explain to you something you don't understand and then use it as an analogy, which I guess is cheating, but we're going to do it. The sun does not operate through a continuous nuclear explosion at its core. That's false. That's what scientists believe, but they're wrong. It operates as a reaction from an intergalactic energy source that beams into it. And that energy source is different than the energy that comes out of the sun. It functions like a step-down generator. So the power lines that you see outside, they run high voltage, and then it gets to a substation or a transformer, and that it's called a transformer because it steps down the voltage down to what you use in your house, because it's not high voltage electricity in your house. That would be very dangerous. So that's the way the sun works, and that's actually the way the earth works as well. There's energy beaming in, and there's actually energy beaming out too, but it steps it down. That's how we all work. All of us works this way. So we receive light from God in whatever form we're able to receive it and willing to receive it, and we emit light out to everything else in whatever form we're capable of doing so. Anyway, that's a deep dive. So we need to get to the point where when we're blasted with things, it doesn't derail us for the whole day, let alone the whole week, let alone the whole month, let alone the whole quarter, let alone the whole year, let alone the rest of our lives. Now, everyone should be able to understand this to an extent, because you can all imagine, or maybe you've had this happen to you, something negative, something you perceive as negative happening to you, and it just derails you for some time. And you know, some people get derailed for the rest of their lives. Well, the space of things that can do that sort of thing to you, it extends far beyond those that you perceive right now. So right now, you might think, well, if I get into a bad car accident and I'm maimed in some way, maybe I'll get better over time, maybe I won't, and then I would have to just deal with that. Like, you can already, things like this happen, or people get sick, or they lose their jobs, or whatever. Well, the space of this goes far beyond these temporal things that you register under your current understanding. And as you come to see more, you'll see that actually the much greater share of these things are spiritual, not physical. And that's a common theme. And you'll begin to perceive these spiritual detractions, this spiritual impedance. And you have to come to see it to progress to the next level. But also, it's going to come with a basket of things that are new to you, that are challenging, that you have to overcome. Okay, well, that was a very long string of ideas just to get to the point that when I read something like this, a million things fire off in my head that I wish I could tell this guy, but I can't. And so I have to boil it down to just 2 sentences. And if you were to read this, you might assume that I was just sitting on the toilet and I cranked this out in 3 seconds, just as long as it would take to type, which is exactly what this guy did in his first message. He didn't even take the time to capitalize the first letter of each sentence. If someone's got that poor of a setup with what they're saying, it's funny how I'm struggling to put this into words, and I'm criticizing someone else for how they're typing. But I'm coming, so same thing, very different situation. Same thing on the outside, very different on the inside, right? It's like an M&M full of chocolate versus an M&M full of dog poop, right? They look the same on the outside, but take a bite, you're going to find out they're very different, right? Okay, so what does he have to say here? Let's go through that. So he says, if you say the Lord told me and you're wrong, then it's really bad. Caps on the really. A better way of saying that would have been to take 4 seconds of your time away from whatever worthless thing this guy was doing and look up the scripture in the Old Testament where Moses records this from the Lord. Okay? That would be an example of sharing the reasons for your conclusion rather than just your conclusion. This is something that modern people really struggle with. They think that a conclusion is the same as the reasons that should be backing it. And that's because modern people are emotive and stupid. We're really feeding human nature here, okay? But it's a point I agree with because it is a scriptural perspective. It is a big deal to say the Lord told me. And if you're wrong, it is really bad. He is correct. But he should have shared his reasons instead of just his conclusion. Also, he should have realized that taking the time to write this out in a way that looks like he put thought into it will affect his credibility. Okay? Now, if he's doing 5,000, if this was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and he's taking a quick second to set some Yahoo on the internet straight, awesome. Thank God for your sacrifice, right? But he's not, okay? He's clearly not. The other thing about awareness is you can see so much more than what is apparent to others. And there's signs all over the place that this guy's life is a raging dumpster fire. I promise you. And I've never met him before, and I would put all kinds of money on it. If we had any idea of what we reveal in everything we say and do, what we reveal about our deep selves, that we do everything we can to keep secret because we're embarrassed about it. It makes us feel guilty. If we had any idea what we reveal in everything we say and do, we would never say anything again. You'd lock yourself up in your basement as if you're Joe Biden running for president, right? And you never come out, you never say anything to anybody for all the same reasons, because people would know you're a moron or that you have all these wicked desires or whatever. But the problem is that they assume that because most people are like them, that there don't exist people who can see everything. But there are. Okay, so I agree with him on that point. And then he continues, people just have no qualms against throwing around the Lord said. I agree. They say it too freely. I agree completely. But then he says, as if they literally hear a voice in their head. I did. In the video where he's criticizing me for saying this, I did literally hear the voice of God. And that's why I said the Lord said. Now that's going to get us to another point here. But I'm just going to stay on his comment. We're going to talk about his other comment, and then we're going to go to that other point, if I can keep this straight. He says, that's called being a false prophet, dude. No. It is stepping things up a notch. It is stepping up the severity of what is going on, the gravity of the situation. Yes, I agree with you there. But this is like calling someone arrogant because they're stating positive qualities that they purport to have. That is not sufficient reason to call someone arrogant. Arrogance does not mean someone thinks they have superior qualities. It means, and they don't. And if you haven't done the work to verify, then you can't call someone arrogant without being a doofus. You see? And then he says, read Jeremiah and Ezekiel and things like this. I guess you have to laugh so you don't cry. Jesus walked around saying things like, a greater than Solomon is here. And for some reason, we don't understand that the more like Jesus we become, the more we're going to say things that approach what he said. Not just informational factoids, but things about ourselves. Jesus said a lot about himself. It wasn't because he was self-focused, it's because his mission was to demonstrate the Father. And because he was like the Father, that required him to talk about himself. He was the only example that we had of what the Father is like. And so he couldn't point to someone else, although he did when he could. He'd point to Moses when he was trying to illustrate something that Moses adequately illustrated. But when he was the best example, he had to just talk about himself because he was there and people could see him and they could see what he was doing. And they didn't see the Father. He said that, right? And so if your job is to be a disciple of Christ, you are going to face situations where in order to point to the Lord, you have to point to yourself. It's not the part of you that you're pointing to is not the you part. It's the one with Jesus part. And people should understand this better than they do and see it as a potential sign of something right instead of a guaranteed sign of something wrong. And we'll get back to this idea of a potential sign of what is right versus a guaranteed sign of what is wrong. But in this case, he's telling me to read Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Well, that's always good advice. But he should read them too. And he should open his mind to the fact that if those guys were here right now, they might slap him silly and say, listen to this guy. He knows what he's talking about. There will be situations in life, in the end times, when a greater than Jeremiah is here, when a greater than Ezekiel is here. And that doesn't mean that any particular person fulfills that description. But it does mean that we ought to be looking very carefully for such people. Then he says, which is comical, I wouldn't be so quick to assume God is speaking to you just because you need him to speak to you so bad that you put words in his mouth. Isn't it interesting that he's accusing me of being quick to assume when he quickly assumes so many things in the same sentence? That I assume that God is speaking to me, that I need him to speak to me, or that I'm putting words in his mouth. And then he says, so many people do that, I hate it. Well, I agree, buddy. And you're one of them. You see? Now his other comment, let me see if I can recall the gist of this now. His other comment was, I guess he took my advice here, because I said, I'd hope that if you're familiar with those scriptures, I'd hope you Okay, I'm sorry about that. We're still rolling. My computer monitor's turned off, and I was afraid my computer went to sleep. I said, if you're familiar with those scriptures, I'd hope you consider the seriousness of calling someone a false prophet without first hearing their message. It's ridiculous. So I guess he took my advice and watched some random video, but the next one he watched, I'm assuming, because I saw a comment for it, was the one where I said what to expect from me in time to come. And his reply to this was something like, I don't even need to watch this to know that you're a false prophet times 1,000 or something like that. So I guess now we're going to power levels like Dragon Ball Z. I don't know. His false prophet level is 9,000. Oh, if you know the show. Anyway. I've never seen a false prophet power level this high. So what's the level of absurdity, first off, of quantifying, like we're just so quick to throw out these ridiculous things that we say, right? I mean, this guy, he was speaking so far beyond the price he has paid to speak. Do you get what I'm saying? If you're a scientist and you want to make some audacious claim in a paper that you're going to send out to peer review, and you say some ridiculous thing and you don't provide all the evidence necessary that you know what you're talking about, they're going to shred you, right? But unfortunately, society, it used to be like that if you make great claims, you have to show great evidence for it. But we're not like that anymore. So if there's some guy who has spent thousands of hours compiling materials, they're very different than everything else that's out there. I guess you could enumerate a few possibilities, and one of them would be that he's totally insane. But it kind of demands a certain level of due diligence before you can credibly say that. How many hours of over 1,000 hours of video would you have to go through before you felt super confident that this person was a quote-unquote false prophet? I don't think it would be 1,000 hours, but I also don't think it would be less than 1 minute. I don't think a reasonable response would be to hop onto one of these videos and say, I don't even need to watch this to know that you are this or that. And it doesn't matter what they're saying, if it's positive or negative, it's equally incredible in the literal sense of the word, not the colloquial sense. It's not credible. All you're doing is putting up a giant neon sign that says, I'm a moron, and nothing I say matters. If anything, you should go in the opposite direction of whatever I say. And I don't understand why there's so many people out there who don't get that. But I'm probably preaching to the choir with the folks who watch this stuff. So let's move on to what I told you, that's not it, that I was going to talk about, which is this. Okay, so in the mix of things that got me here, I saw this article on Fox News. U.S. says 8,000 North Korean soldiers to begin combat operations in war with Ukraine in coming days, okay? Now, this whole rigmarole with Ukraine and Russia has been very interesting. I've tried to relay to you some thoughts about the future and China and Iran and Russia and North Korea. And when I started saying these things, very, very few people had said anything similar, and probably nobody that you had heard of. And the people who had said things about it, it was decades prior, and there were up and down cycles of times when it was very, very unlikely that that was the case. And so who knows what they were talking about and whether they had any reason to say it or not, okay? But since I said it, and have said it again and again, we've seen this recurring increase in evidence that this is absolutely a reasonable thing to expect to happen. What is the thing? It's the invasion of the United States by China and Russia and their friends. Now, when I first started saying that, there was no strong alliance between China and Russia. There was no active conflict where we were engaged with them in proxy countries. That's what's going on in Ukraine. And so the evidence that suggests increased likelihood of this outcome, it just keeps flowing in. And here's an example of that, okay? And I thought that this was interesting, given that, this random dude, is calling me a false prophet. Now, as far as the P word, I don't like using that word. And there are a few reasons for that. The main one is that it's not a good idea to adopt language that means different things to different people, if it can be avoided. And that's because you're inviting them to take the argument to a space where they will have an unfair advantage, which means that they'll be more empowered to argue false ideas. There are so many gospel topics that we assume are simple, like baptism, for example, that are actually, they have layers and there are different versions. And the ideas mean very different things. And to dig into this, it just requires a greater, a more sophisticated model. It requires greater sophistication. And if you lock yourself into this simplicity, you can only get out very little. You can only get very little out of the whole thing, okay? So we need to amp up the sophistication and graduate from kindergarten with these things. So as far as prophets go, this is something that is still future for me to lay out completely, so up to the level of what I've been taught about it. But I did make this post a little over 3 years ago. I put this out, and maybe it's worth highlighting this. I don't know what words to use to describe it, but it's really something to go back and look at things where time has passed, whether they be books or videos or blog posts, and to see just how much is laid out and just how few people notice. And what I'd like to do with this is help you notice some things. Now, if you're still with me, I don't know how long this video is so far, but we're not done yet. We still have to go through this, and it's going to take a little bit. So I will reward you for hanging around with the things I'm going to say about this. So this is from August 22nd, 2021. That's the original publication. I actually republished this on March 7th, 2022. So now this is a third time, and that should trigger some alarms in your mind. Today I received an email. Rather than write a specific reply to that person, here are two extracted portions of that email and my reply to all people. Quote, I appreciate that so much of what you've written in the last few years has come to pass, exactly as you said it would. Others scoff, saying not everything happened just like he said. End quote. When the prophecies of Samuel, all of which seemed absurd, began to be fulfilled, the people did not respond by believing in God. Instead, they said, some things they may have guessed right among so many, but behold, we know that all these great and marvelous works cannot come to pass, of which has been spoken. Now, I'll pause here. Isn't it interesting how things can happen exactly as God said they would, and yet people don't notice? There are so many prophecies in the scriptures, and they happen in real time. They're being fulfilled before your very eyes, and no one notices. Now, sometimes people will call it out, and this is a meta level of this, if you've noticed. So I read Helaman 16:16, and that pattern is exactly what was played out in this email that I received. Do you see how the language is exactly the same? The person writing the email had no idea that this was an established pattern that has reoccurred from Scripture. And that sort of thing happens all the time. But people don't notice, and usually no one will call it out and pull up the chapter and verse and say, see how this is exactly the same? Okay, I'll continue reading here. It did not matter that, and now I'll continue reading from Helaman 16, 13, and 14, great signs were given unto the people and wonders, and the words of the prophets began to be fulfilled. And angels did appear unto men, wise men, and did declare unto them glad tidings of great joy. Thus in this year the scriptures began to be fulfilled. Now I didn't point it out in this post, but one of the reasons that I included verse 14 was that this is also a principle that's very important that you're seeing fulfilled in front of your very eyes. It says, angels did appear unto men, wise men, and did declare unto them glad tidings of great joy. Why did they only appear to wise men? Why did the wise men go to see Jesus? Why wasn't it like the country bumpkin, drunkard guy? Angels, we read about this in Moroni 7. I made a very long series of videos on that. God flows light and truth disproportionately to the people who use it the best. Angels appear to wise men. Angels appear to those who have a sound mind in every form of godliness. What does that mean? They have rejected evil. They have embraced improvement in all things in their lives. They're living up to the light and truth that they have. They've been true and faithful to what they've received, and God gives them more. Disproportionately, more requires angels. Why? Because they're like a sponge that has soaked up all the water they're sitting in, and they still have room for more. And so you have to put water in there from outside of whatever container they're in. God will use everything around you, and only after you've used that up and you're applying it in the best way you know will he send more. So why don't angels minister to you? Probably angels from heaven minister to you, probably because you're not paying attention to the angels on earth. Why don't you have new resources in your life? Probably because you're not using the resources God has already given you very well. And so here we have this deep idea that's just glancingly touched on in this post, laying here for anyone with eyes to see, with the faith to dig into it. Continuing to read this, it is good to be a sincere skeptic. God operates through reason. All reason leads to God, and God leads to all reason. Let's just pause there. That's 3 short sentences that defy limits throughout Christianity. And if you really dug into that, then you'd save me years of my life in not having to write books to explain it further. Continuing. However, a lot of skepticism in what passes for reason is actually rationalization, which is the counterfeit use of reason for the purposes of obfuscating one's dishonesty and delusion. Delusion is defined as persisting in a way of thinking or acting after being shown sufficient reasons to change. Even before addressing the apparent misses, the people who scoff should ask, how could one person be so right on so many things that were so unlikely? They should look at the Pharisees' behavior and analyze their criticisms of Jesus. They would say the same exact things they say to me, to Jesus, were he here as a man today. There's a lot to that paragraph. I'm not going to unpack it. Ether 12:26. And when I said this, the Lord spake unto me, saying, Fools mock, but they shall mourn, and my grace is sufficient for the meek, that they shall take no advantage of your weakness. These folks would call Jonah a liar because Nineveh was not destroyed, as he said God said it would be. They would call Jesus a liar for all sorts of things, such as when he said he was coming soon. They don't understand the basis of these things. They don't understand that predictions are based on conditions that can change, and even prophecies from the mouth of God can change if the people change. On the subject of apparent misses, some of these simply haven't happened yet. Presenting these as a list does not imply that the list is ordered. This video, which that was a link to the video I made called When the Fig Leaves Sprout, I believe. This video, for instance, is arranged topically, not chronologically. When you see that so many things were exactly right, and when few, if any, believed them, and they seemed to be very far off, if at all possible, what in the world should not cause you to dismiss the things that have not happened as necessarily wrong. That sentence should really be revised. Sorry. Instead, it should increase your willingness to believe those other things will in fact happen and could in fact happen just as suddenly and out of nowhere as the other things. Any other reaction is necessarily irrational, at least. I have made genuine bad calls, such as my incorrect prediction that the Ebola outbreak years ago would go global. Explaining this in detail is important and valuable, but we'll have to wait until I can do that in context, which I will do in future books. In short, I will say the following, and those who can put the pieces together and value from it will do so. There are 2 types of prophecy, generative and relayed. There are probably better words for this. Relayed prophecy is what you are familiar with. It's the thus saith the Lord messages that come from God's audible voice or angels. These are the majority of what we have in the scriptures as messages to prophets. There is another form which comes from the individual's composite of everything they have been taught about God. Previously, I spoke of Revelation explaining the world like lights illuminate a city in the night. There are bright spots and dark spots, and one who wishes to, say, design a path through the city must necessarily pass through spots of greater or lesser understanding. My COVID predictions are a great example of this. I told the world on YouTube that a super flu from China was coming. I made all sorts of other predictions in that video and subsequently on Facebook. Things like mandatory vaccines, school attendance implications, shortages, etc. Things very few people believed when I said them. All of these things have happened exactly as I said they would. Among all of this, I made numeric predictions of how many people would die from COVID. This was after COVID started. As I explained on Facebook, this was very simple, rational projection of the scientists' contemporary case fatality rate. There was no magic there. It didn't include the possibility of lockdowns, which honestly I never expected governments would be stupid enough to do. I still believe we will see just as many deaths as I said would occur, just in a longer timeline due to the draconian government interventions, which the science, TM, is now showing to do nothing but extend out the inevitable death of all who would have died from COVID anyway, which will include more people every year since age is a factor. As I've said many times from the beginning, everyone who can die from COVID will die from COVID. I'm pausing from the read here. This was posted originally August 22nd, 2021, and that is exactly what happened. In the past, I have been more willing to share emissions that included areas I knew less about. I incorrectly assumed people would derive whatever value was in what I said and keep charging forward where more or better was needed, or available, I'll add. I figured people would value some idea of what is coming, even if it's not an exact idea. I am far more cautious about this today, knowing far better how awful, insensible, and stubborn people are. This is part of why I only have one prophecy video on YouTube. I could say far more, and I frequently want to, but when I try, God says, what good will it do? If the people require Loctite, irrefutable instruction, let them wait for the long-form books to come. They have and reject enough as it stands. Now, I am going to pause here, and we'll come back to the rest of this. But now I'm going to jump to some scriptures, just two. I recently made a video on Isaiah 28, although I'm not sure the order I'm going to publish these two videos in, so it may or may not be out, but it's just called Isaiah 28. And I go through the first, 15 verses here, maybe fewer, but the first half or so of the chapter. But this is the part I just want to reference here and now. We'll start actually up here. And maybe I'll just keep this at a high level and refer you to that video. That's, I guess, what I'll do. This is exactly what I was just talking about in that post. That people require things to be precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little and there a little. And it creates insuperable barriers for the Lord to teach you what you require so that you can avoid negative consequences that exist beyond your understanding. Do you see how that works? If not, go watch the video on Isaiah 28. There is comfort promised to those who obtain and follow the word of the Lord. But unfortunately, what has to be said to these people, what could be said, and what has to be said, will be interpreted by them as stammering lips and another tongue, because they use all the wrong things to indicate the value or lack thereof in what God says to them through his servants. They're looking for the wrong indicators, and they haven't developed their ability to understand sufficiently so that they can extract the value in the way it has to come. And because of that, and it's referenced here, bad things will happen to them, and it's referenced here. Now that was Isaiah 28, this is Isaiah 30. Where we get these messages about an ensign on a hill, about a beacon on top of the mountain, and how that's what's left as the people who are less sensible are destroyed, less responsive to the Lord's word. And in that destruction, the Lord is exalted. The goodness of how he is made more evident to the people who presently do not value that goodness. Again, they look at it like stammering tongues and what was it? Stammering lips in another tongue. It's like you speak a foreign language. These are literally things that have been said to me more than once by people who did not realize they were fulfilling scriptural patterns. Right? It's on a comment on a book review on Amazon. It's enshrined there, but it's been said to me more than once. It's like you're speaking in a foreign language, because I am. Because my native language is the Spirit of God. And I'm translating this into English and into the ideas that you already understand. I'm adopting your language to be able to explain to you things from a higher realm. And it is a labor. It is a very intense labor. And it requires the carrying of burdens beyond what you can understand. Because when you have that degree of awareness that you have to have in order to do that, it affects every second of every day of your life, and every second when you're even asleep. So, the people that don't listen to that because they're waiting for some kind of shinier bottle, they don't want the wine from the Lord, they want the wine of Babylon, which the wine of God is the blood of Christ. They don't want to drink that. They don't want to be like him. They don't want to rise to the level where they can receive from him more directly. They insist on receiving things in the Babylonian way. Well, here's what happens. They're mostly destroyed, but the survivors will come to the point, this is again from Isaiah 30, they'll receive the bread of adversity and the water of affliction. But the blessing here is that their teachers will not be removed into a corner anymore, but thine eyes shall see thy teachers. You will recognize the people that God has sent, because you don't right now. And thine ears shall hear a word behind thee, saying, This is the way, walk ye in it, when ye turn to the right hand and when ye turn to the left. What is that saying? You will remember the things that they taught you when you weren't listening, and you'll have to operate on that memory of what they taught you to get the guidance you need to go to where you need to go. Of course, no one understands this. This is the only place you've ever heard it. Back to the blog post. Well, maybe I'll reread the last bit. In the past, I've been more willing to share admissions that included areas I knew less about. I incorrectly assumed people would derive whatever value was in what I said and keep charging forward where more or better was needed. I figured people would value some idea of what is coming, even if it is not an exact idea. I am far more cautious about this today, knowing far better how awful, insensible, and stubborn people are. This is part of why I only have one prophecy video on YouTube, which was true at the time I posted this. Now there's a whole playlist, although you probably haven't noticed. I could say far more, and I frequently want to, but when I try, God says, what good will it do? If the people require Loctite, irrefutable instruction, let them wait for the long-form books to come. They have and reject enough as it stands. I have so much to produce and so little time to do it, that it is akin to a marathon runner gasping out a few words to the crowd as he runs by wherever they stand. I cannot turn back without preventing the delivery of greater things to those who are more deserving. That is just the way it is. I am frequently surprised when I see or hear something I have written or spoken previously. Mostly, I am shocked that I said something so openly in the past that I probably would not say so openly today. I'm shocked to see just how much light is spoken so plainly in the things I wrote years ago, and I would add, recorded years ago now. While I don't obfuscate things intentionally today, I do break ideas up and scatter them across books and chapters, knowing that releasing these things too soon in too great plainness just results in greater condemnation, and that those with eyes to see will find what they are ready to see. I have more than 14 books in progress, and I would guess more than 3,000 pages of content typed in within so far. I would edit this here. I have 24 books in progress, at least, and I think well over 10,000 pages written up so far. Continuing the post, I now withhold much in order to save it for a time when it can come out in a more polished form. I'm trying to finish these things as fast as possible. It's indescribably difficult. Not too long ago, the Lord came to me and bluntly reviewed many of the prophecies I've made. I was surprised, but it's not like I had kept these those in mind as I went about my business. He laid them out rapid fire and said, "All of these have been fulfilled. And who has reacted appropriately?" I said, "No one, Lord." He said, "That is right." The longer form descriptions are coming and will come, but you're going to have to wait for them. That's too bad, because you'd be much better off with an idea of what is coming than to have to wait for the exact descriptions. This is a 40 years in the wilderness situation. It won't take that long, but it will be far worse for you than those Israelites. As you receive what you have chosen, try to appreciate that it was your choice and find some peace in that. While the persistent willful sin of those who know about me, speaking generally, prevents me from revealing greater things in faster or more plain ways, I'm instructed from time to time to say enough that I leave guideposts behind, so that when these things happen, people have unquestionable evidence that God is involved here. I showed you just now a scriptural reference to that idea, and there are more, but I won't take the time to show them to you right now. It is shocking to me to see such plain signs minimized and ignored, but then I read the scriptures and see that this is how things have always been. For instance, go and read about Nephi's adventures in the book of Helaman. I quote from the original email here again, "Your witness, if I understand it correctly, is that sticking to Christ is all that really matters." End quote. This, in combination with a greater understanding of who and how Jesus is the real and chief sign. Everything that gives us better reasons to obey God and know what that means comes from God and comprise the rungs that lead to him. It is simply exactly what it means to point to and lead others to Christ. Jesus came to help others understand how the Father is. His disciples come to help others understand how Jesus is. Stepping out of the quote here, that is the role of the Holy Ghost, isn't it? And don't angels speak by the power of the Holy Ghost? What is the tongue of angels? Continuing in this blog post. I will give you a great key here. I have often spoken about how God's servants seek to be redundant. Well, their desire to be so and their capacity to bring others to the point where it is true are both conditions of how close they are to the Lord in character and knowledge. If you would merely obey everything God tells you all the time, I would be completely irrelevant to you. Unfortunately, you do not yet understand what that means, and even if you did, you're not willing to do it. Now I'll pause here because maybe that's a mysterious thing that I just said. Or, as I'm perceiving, at least some of you will assume that I'm meaning something different than what I said, even though I said it very plainly. Understand that justification and sanctification are two different things, and I wasn't referring just to justification. You can measure up to what you currently understand the Lord would do in your place. That's the beginning. It's called the gate. It's the beginning of a process. In that process, God will reveal to you more about himself. And that in many cases, that will entail things that you'd rather not know. Because in your current appraisal of value, you will see what he's telling you to do as unpleasant, at least. And so when I say, if you would merely obey everything God tells you all the time, I would be completely irrelevant to you, what I mean is you would come up in that process to the same point where I am. And therefore, you would not need anything from me. Continuing the quote, there are many people on this earth who are not willing to discover the meaning of obedience, but will, in time, be willing to do it once they are shown in plain, indisputable, persuasive argument. You may or may not be one of them, but that's up to you. Well, that concludes everything that I'd like to say in this video. Thank you for staying with me if you've watched this long, and I hope that you've found things in what I've said that identify ways that you can improve. And I hope you take those steps to do it.